Welcome to NASP Dialogues. The Dialogue podcasts focus on events and issues in school psychology. I'm Rebecca Comizio, Chair of NASP's Communication Committee and moderator of our current dialogue. Today, joining us is Beth Dahl, Professor of School Psychology at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Welcome.
Thank you.
Beth, how did you learn about school psychology?
I was in the middle of my master's program in clinical child psychology. And as I reached my practicum and I went out to a residential treatment center for my practicum, half of the other students there were from a school psychology program. And I realized as I worked with all the kids that I was assigned that I spent half my time calling their teachers and talking with the school, and that in fact teachers were pretty responsive and had a lot of power and impact over what was happening in those kids' lives. So I decided to continue on in school psychology instead of in clinical child. My school had never had a school psychologist, so I'd never seen one in practice.
Have you been satisfied with your career choice?
Oh, I have been, but I think that those of us that really entered school psychology as a group in the early 80s, we have worked hard and we've changed the field to be what we thought it ought to be. It was a rare opportunity for building a profession in many ways from a very tiny role in the back hallways of schools into something that was more essential and important to the school.
Sure. How has the field changed since you entered the field in 1977, and what has remained the same?
Well, when I entered the field in 1977, the federal laws related to the education of kids with disabilities had just passed. And that created a huge need for school psychologists in schools that hadn't existed before. So before that, I think that school psychologists were employed in some states and not others, and they sometimes were giving IQ tests and carrying around little kits, and other times they were operating as if they had a small clinical practice in an office in a school building. So there wasn't necessarily a single common role for school psychologists before the passage of the federal special education laws. So I, as many of my colleagues, was the first school psychologist that my school had, and all they knew that I could do was give them the IQ test scores for kids in special education, and I did that. But I also gave every school something in addition. In one school, it was working with a particular challenging child. In another school, it was a training program for teachers. In a third school, I was working with a group of kids and with social problems and friendships. And so every principal got a little taste of something more. And they began to talk, and the buildings began to ask for more. Fortunately, they asked for more when they were in meetings with the district superintendent. So over several years, positions were added that made it possible to have a more extended role.
Do you think school psychology is achieving its potential?
Well, I would say that we are working towards very ambitious goals, and we are progressing towards those goals. I'm not sure that we'll ever reach it, because I think the more we learn about how to be an effective agent for mental health in schools, the more we learn we need to do. So we are working rapidly towards a goal that's changing rapidly.
Specifically, how have assessment practices changed over the past 40 years?
Well, I mentioned in a talk the other day the assessments that were available to me in 1980 when I stepped into a school for the first time as a school psychologist were developed by psychologists who had already died. And so things were very locked into a routine and a tradition in assessment. We had a Binet or a Wechsler scale. You gave the Bender Gestalt. You gave the draw person. Those weren't enough to make the kinds of judgments that we needed to make about what kids needed. And I think both the fact that school psychologists were advocating strongly for better and more technically sound assessments and more current assessments, but also the field of special education was growing rapidly. We've come to a very different world in assessment. We now have enough tools, alternative tools for assessing children in alternative ways that we can match the assessment strategies that we use to the questions that we have about kids. Before, we had to tell people these are the questions I can answer and these are the ones I can't. And I think that our assessments that we're using are far more rigorous. They're technically sound. They have more validity. We can have more faith in them, and I think that we have become not test administrators, but as professions, we've become true examiners in which we provide the assessment given the questions that are most important about the child, but we moderate our answers given our broad understanding of the child and the context, and not just the results of the tests.
How have school mental health intervention services changed over the past 40 years?
That's been huge. The book about interventions that I took with me into my first year as a school psychologist was a printed list of 140 recommendations that you could make at the end of your psychological report on a child. And that was really the sum total of options available to us to consult. And then the next step was that we began using the kinds of therapeutic interventions that had been developed for clinical and counseling sites, 15-minute hour type interventions. Those were moved into the schools in some cases. That was not a very efficient model, and often what worked instead was opening up a room or some rooms in a school where community mental health services could have a local site. And I know that when I was in Wisconsin, there were some districts that were using that very nicely. But that really wasn't satisfying the problem because we have too many kids with needs and too few pediatric mental health services. So I think that we began to demand and support when they were available, and actually advocate actively for interventions that were evidence-based but meant to be used in schools and by school-employed providers. And so we now have a whole array of models of intervention services that are designed specifically for schools. If you walk through the exhibit hall, you see that in some cases these have been commercialized to the point where there are some former school psychologists that are making big money selling off their various interventions for playgrounds or social emotional learning, and which is, not to be disrespectful, that can be very useful, but more of what we use are coming out of our research labs and especially school mental health researchers that are developing manualized intervention programs, but with the intention that those be used in schools. So I'm particularly excited about the acknowledgement in schools, the importance of wellness promoting interventions in addition to interventions that try to address children with a mental disorder. And so I'm thinking that we're pushing the envelope from school-based mental health. We're pushing the envelope for how children ought to be receiving services in schools.
What are the strengths of school psychologists currently?
I think one of the big strengths of school psychologists that's reflected in our advocacy for MTSS, for the practice model that's come out in NASP, is that we tend to think about mental health and children's needs in terms of the enrollment of the school. It's very much a public health framework for thinking about mental health services. And it's emerging in school psychology and the other school mental health professions because we are with the kids when they walk in the morning, we see them in the lunchroom, we pass them in the hallway, we are in their classroom, we see them in the everyday moments that they have, and we see all the kids. And so I think that's given us just an innate understanding of the whole child within the various contexts that they live that allows us to have a very comprehensive understanding of mental health for kids.
In the future, what will the professional identity of school psychologists be?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, and know that I'm a bit of a Pollyanna, so I think that things are only going to get bigger and better. One of the things that I think we hold for the future is that we are making inroads into schools using data about kids' social, emotional, and psychological learning and wellness and health. And principals and superintendents are starting to realize in particular that that data helps them refine where they put their resources and what's important. And it helps us understand if we're making progress and to change course if we're not. So I think that the use of data in mental health is becoming more and more not just accepted, but endorsed. And I think that's going to continue to grow. I think another really interesting phenomena that we have always faced is that we're part of a group of mental health providers. There's school psychologists, there's also school counselors, there's school social workers. We're separated by history, but we're not really separated by current role. The overlap in role right now is huge. And the truth is that they need more of all of us. So I wonder if we're going to be entering a realm in which we'll see more merging of those school mental health professions. I think that there was a time in the 80s, it was certainly classic, when the school mental health professions were not broadly respected. And so within ourselves, we would have these little turf battles. School psychologists are better prepared than school social workers. Now, school social workers really understand therapy better. But in fact, I'm thinking of a conference that I went to in Kentucky when I was just becoming involved in the State School Psychological Association. We had a joint conference with the State Psychological Association, and they introduced us as the fair-haired stepchildren of psychology, which we all took offense, and they thought they were being so very generous. I don't think that would happen now. I think that the reality is that schools are providing the mental health services. There aren't the resources or the private providers or the models in community and clinical mental health services to meet the needs of all the kids that we have enrolled in schools. And I think that we are becoming respected, well respected in our own right. And I think that will lessen the turf among the mental health providers in schools.
That certainly is a wonderful perspective on the past, the present, and the future of our terrific field. Thank you so much, Beth, for joining me today. This concludes this Dialogues podcast. Please tune in again for future Dialogue podcasts available on the NASP website.